Good evening to you. Good evening to you.
Maybe we should sit all in the same area, so we
Yeah.
don't have to,
I think that's a great idea.
you just have to put Marty Feldman trick.
Oh, Marty Feldman, great reference.
Son told me, he said, go watch the new Frankenstein movie. I said, I'm not watching any Frankenstein movie unless Mel Brooks and Marty Feldman are in it, you know.
Great, great reference.
Touching.
Okay. Hi, Simi. How are you? Okay.
All on the same side of it. Are we?
So this is an issue that you may feel doesn't have that many applications, but it has fast applications because we know that unfortunately people get divorced all the time. And the question is, are they allowed to continue maintaining the same social circles that they once did? Let's say they're empty nesters. They don't have children. What if their friends are all the same friends and they want to be able to maintain the same social connections and they interact every once in a while? Is that considered okay? Are they allowed to continue seeing each other socially after a divorce? What if a couple is divorced and they have children and they have shared custody? How do they deal with that without violating the standards of Yichud? Okay, so there are clear halachas about this that I wanted to discuss with you because it actually did come up in a situation where there was a man a man and a woman divorced. They have children. She's in the house. He's in another place. But his office was in the house. And he wanted to be able to continue working from the house. He said, I'm not sleeping there. I'm going there during business hours. But quite often, my wife is there. My kids are there. Is there a problem? Is there not a problem? So it's worth examining to see what the halachic issues are. So let's take a look. We'll start with the Gemara that starts this whole topic off. All right, laser. So, like I said, there are many, many practical applications of where this could be halachically problematic. So the Gemara in Ksuvas, Daf Chaf Zayin Amid Beis, is really where this topic begins, on top of Chaf Ches Amid Aleph. Tanya, Hamigareshet Ishto, Lo Tinaseh Bishchunato. That if a man divorces his wife, she should not, literally it means to get married, but actually as the Meforshim understand, she should not dwell in his neighborhood. And as Rashi says, Lefisha makira biramizotav ukritzotav, shema yavo'u lidei avera. Rashi explains that the reason why they should no longer live in the same neighborhood is because they have a familiarity with each other. A crowd that they're in won't even notice that they're making signals to each other. They'll be winking at each other and making private signals to each other that could make them have some kind of rendezvous at some point where no one would be even aware. Okay, and so there's going to be some engendering of familiarity and friendship that will develop if they continue seeing each other socially. Vimhaya Kohen lo tadur imo b'mavoy. Now the Gemara says it gets even worse if she was married to a Kohen. If the man she was married to was a Kohen, so it gets worse. Why does it get worse? Because when a couple gets divorced and there's no Kohen, what's the worst that'll happen? They'll reignite their relationship. They can get remarried. She, after all, is not usher to him. But if he's a Kohen, then she's usher midoraisa to him. So not only must she distance herself from his shchuna, but even from the mavui. And it's important to know that in the times of the Gemara, the neighborhoods were structured such that each chatzer had a bunch of homes that was called a shchuna. let's say typically 2 to 4 homes per courtyard. And then a mavoi would typically have 2 or more chatzerot. So therefore, a mavoi is an even a larger area that she has to live clear of. Okay, im haya kfar katan, ze haya ma'aseh, if it's a small village that they live in, this actually occurred. Va'amru kfar katan nidon kishchuna. A small village is like a neighborhood because there's the accessibility between the two of them is just as prevalent as if their homes were in the same courtyard. Now the question is, mi nidcha mipnei mi? Who's got to move out, the man or the woman? What would be your guess before you see the Gemara's answer?
Man should move.
You're so chivalrous, Abi.
The woman.
You would think so because sneers for her. Why should we make her pick up? It's not sneers. Okay? It's a good argument. But that's actually not the conclusion of the Gemara. Tashma detanya, he nidches mipanav ve'enhu nidcha mipaneh. She has to move out, not him. The Gemara qualifies it that I'm skipping that part, that if she owns the property, then she gets to kick him out. But that would be the only exception. So my haviala. So what was the final upshot? Tashma, hine Hashem mitaltelecha taltala gever. That God is going to cause you to go into exile like the exile of a man. Now, what does that mean, like the exile of a man? V'amarav tiltule de gavra kashin midiitza. That the exile of a man is worse than the exile of a woman. Now, why do you think that is? The exile of a man, says the Gemara, is worse than the exile of a woman. Can you imagine? Can you think of any reason?
Because he's got a minion to go to.
Yeah. The women, they're invisible to the outside world. So whether they're invisible in this shchuna or that shchuna doesn't make that much of a difference. But a man is much more out in the open, and therefore his exile from his social circle is going to be much more difficult. That seems to be the way that seems to be the mahalach. Tana Rabbanan, lava himena benichse avia and nifras ela yedei acher. The Gemara then goes further on the same theme, that if the husband had taken a loan out from his wife, let's say she has a wealthy father, and he owes money to her that he would normally pay back to her after they get divorced. Ena nifras ela yedei acher. She cannot collect the debt. She has to send someone else to collect it, again, because of the concern that they should not fraternize with each other after the divorce. And of course, this becomes the question, how do you deal with child custody issues? They're going to be interacting with each other so long as their kids are minors. So the Gemara doesn't deal with that question. Omer of Sheshes, v'yasu lekaman ladina lo mizdak kinan lahu. And furthermore, if they have a lawsuit pending against each other, we will not hear their case because we don't want them to be in court together. Totally contrary to the way things are today in divorce court. Rav Papa Amar Shamuti Mishamtinan Lahu, we even would put them in Chayrim if they would insist on having a din Torah. Rav Huna Bereder Rav Yeshua Amar Negudi Nami Minagdinan Lahu, we even give them lashes. Amar of Nachman Tana be'evil Rabasi Bamed Var Mamur Sheniskarshem in Hanusuin Aval Kusheniskarshem in Erisin Nifras La Yedei Atzma She'en Libo Gaspa. But all of the aforementioned is if they actually had consummated the marriage and then gotten divorced. But if they were simply betrothed to each other, never having lived together as husband and wife, so then we're not as concerned that they're going to be fraternizing with familiarity with each other. Okay? Now, the Shita Mekubetzes asks the question, why is the language lo tinaseh bishchunato? She shouldn't get married literally in his neighborhood. V'lo katani v'lo tidor, mishum da'ad shelo niseit risha vaday lador bishchunato, kitei shetehei karova elav, ulai yachzor v'yakadesh osa v'yitpayisu. The answer is, the Shita Mekubetzes surprisingly says, that if she hasn't yet gotten married, and he's not a Kohen, then not only is there not a problem for them to live in the same neighborhood, but it's actually desirable for them to live in the same neighborhood because maybe they'll be able to rekindle what was lost. I mean, I've had that situation where I've been Masader Kiddushin for a couple that was previously divorced and then decided they made a mistake and they got remarried. Okay. But v'im grushas kohen he da'asur la'achzir grushaso afilu kodem sheniseis lo soter b'chol hamovi shelo. But that's only if the guy's not a kohen. If he's a kohen, then she can't live even in his mavoi t'chayshinan shema yityached ima, because we're worried that he may have yichud with her. Ulefichach irchiku bir grushas kohen tvei mi grushas Yisrael afilu la'achar sheniseis t'mayla yisera asu b'yuchsin. So that's the way the Shita Mikubetzis understands the Gemara. So for a single woman who's married to a Yisrael, no problem for them to live in the same shchuna. For a Kohen who's married and they get divorced, so then she has to distance herself even further than a woman who was married to a Yisrael and then gets remarried to another man, right? Because they made extra stringencies for Kohanim. Now the Shulchan Aruch understands this is not. The way the Shita understands the Gemara is not agreed upon by all the poskim, but because of time constraints, I'm not going to belabor the point. There's a big machlokas between the Chelkas Mechokek and the Beis Shmuel, who trace this issue to a machlokas between the Ran and the Rambam as to how to properly understand the Gemara. And the question really becomes, what if a couple are able to act with restraint and say that we will not have yichud with each other? Can they continue to live in the same shchuna? This seems to be a machlokas. But in any event, let's take a look at how the Shulchan Aruch understands it. Source number 3. Misha giresh ishto min hanesuin lo tader imo bechatzer shema yava ulidei zunus. Bim hayakohen lo tader imo b'mavoy ukvar katan nidon kemavoy. The Shulchan Aruch is quoting the exact same language of the Gemara. So because we've seen the Gemara, we don't need to retranslate it. And the Ramah says, V'im niseis la'acher afilu b'Yisrael lo tadur imo b'mavoy. So the Tur clearly understands it differently from the Shita Mekubetzes, and he says that once the woman gets remarried, even if she was married to a Yisrael, but she marries a different man, then the couple should not live not only in the same shchuna, but not even in the same mavoy, not even in the same general area. B'chol zeh b'mavoy sasum. But that's only when it is a closed mavoy, which means that it's still semi-private. It's a neighborhood. You've got more than one courtyard filled with multiple houses, and you've got one alleyway running between them, but it's a dead-end street, like a cul-de-sac. So therefore, it's still semi-private. But if it's a mavoy mefulash, if it's a street that opens up on both ends and there's much more foot traffic and even horse or car traffic, so then they can live on either side of that mavoy, and that's not going to be a problem. In Mershus Rabim Mafsik Bein Batem Afilu Ein B'chol Ir Shum Yehudi Rakim Levad Shari. And we'll go even further. If there's a mamish, a public thoroughfare, or what we call a Reshus Harabim, between their two homes, then even if they're the only two Jews in the entire city, then it's perfectly fine for them to live on either side of the Reshus Harabim. Now, the reason for that being is because even though she's already remarried, there's no fear that they're going to rekindle their relationship because the public will be able to track their comings and goings. That's the argument. And if a man divorces a woman because she's usher to him, let's say he discovers that his wife was unfaithful, and unfortunately, she had an affair. So he's not allowed to remarry her. So even if he divorces her and he ends up not remarrying her, it's as if she's already remarried because she's usher to him. And therefore, all of the halachas that would apply to a woman who remarries applies to this woman. Okay? So far, so good. We're going to skip this whole machlokas between the Chelkas Mechokek and the Beis Shmuel because it's a little bit complicated. So let's go on. The question is, how do we define shchuna, mavoy, etc., Bisman Hazeh, are the city structures that we have today are very different from the city structures that existed in the times of the Gemara. So Rav Elyashiv was asked this question, and it says in the Sefer Ashrei Ha'ish, Nishal Rabbeinu lefi hametzias shel zmanenu manikra ota hechatzer. When we say that a man and a woman, even before they get remarried, may not live in the same courtyard, how does that translate into modern day building structures? A lot of times you could have multiple buildings in one courtyard where there's no street dividing them. What would be the halacha today? V'heishiv shehayom be'eretz Yisrael kol binyan megurim nikra chatzer echad. So Rav Elyashiv's answer is, if you live in the same building, that's like living in the same chatzer. Aval binyan nifrad afsha binyanim tzmudim ze lazeh v'kechatzer acheret. But if you're living in two separate buildings, two separate apartment buildings, even if they're next door to each other, that's like living in two separate chatzers. Umutar lahem lagur sham heyot v'yesh l'chol binyan kenisa nifredet. Then the couple, as long as the woman has not yet remarried, they can live in those two separate buildings, because it's considered, since each building has its own separate entrance, we're not concerned that there's going to be any fraternization between the two of them that won't eventually be discovered, and therefore it's perfectly okay. Now, of course, once she gets remarried, then there may still be a problem if the buildings are next door to each other. Then it would probably be necessary for them to have some kind of thoroughfare dividing between their two residences. So this is important to keep in mind. I'm not aware of any suspension of this halacha.
Couldn't we be less concerned if she remarries, because then she's remarried?
You would think. However, I think the attitude of Chazal in this situation is that, I forget the exact quote from Chazal, but a woman always remembers her first lover, is the way, I forget the language of Chazal. It's a Gemara, I think, in Kiddushin somewhere. But a woman always remembers her first, the man who deflowered her. And there's going to be that natural affinity to him. And therefore, if it's only an Isser Penuya, so then we're more makel. And like the Shita says, perhaps even it's acceptable for, them to live in proximity, because we want to maybe, hopefully, halavai, that they should get remarried. But once she gets remarried, she may still have feelings for her first husband, and now she's an Eishes Ish. Okay.
Tendency towards jealousy. Now that she's hooked up with someone else, that makes her more attractive to him.
Okay, I mean, he may want to pursue her more. Yeah. Okay. Now, Rav Zilberstein asked the interesting question that I know was on your mind, which is, why does the Gemara say that she has to move out and not the husband? Now, again, this has very halacha l'maisa applications, because let's say a couple is living on Theodore. Okay, they get just I'm throwing out Theodore because it's almost like its own. It's like its own little shtetl. It's like its own chutzner, And then a couple gets divorced, and she decides she's going to move to a different house. She's going to live in the basement of one of her friends. First of all, who has to move out? So it's not so simple. It depends whose name is on the title of the house. If the house is jointly owned, that may also be that it's not so clear that she would be forced to move out. But let's say the husband's name is on the title of the house. We would say, or let's say they were renting. So we would say the wife has to move out because till tule de gavra, the wandering of a man is worse than the wandering of a woman. Unless you could argue that him staying in the same street, just moving a couple of houses down, is not considered to be going into exile. But that wouldn't solve the problem. And therefore, this has very practical applications. If a couple is going to ask a shaila, now that we're divorced, where can one of us live vis-a-vis the other? We want to be nearby so that the kids won't be inconvenienced. You got to at least live across the street in a place where there's a public thoroughfare. So if he's living or she's living on Theodore, we would at least want her to live on the other side of York Hill, or on the other side of Hilda, or on the other side of Clark, something to that effect, right? Let me close. Okay. So I was looking all over trying to find a svara as to why it's fair to force the woman to leave. And the only thing I could find was a svara that was offered by Rav Elyashiv in the name of his son-in-law, Rav Zilberstein. So he says, as a matter of fact, Rav Elyashiv raises a stira where it seems that we're more compassionate to a woman than we are to a man in many instances as far as forcing her to travel. So, for example, there's a Gemara in Bava Metzia which talks about the law of bar mitzvah. You familiar with the law of bar mitzvah? What does that law state? If I own a piece of property and you're my neighbor, you have an adjacent field, and I'm selling my field, you have first rights of refusal. That's Dina de bar mitzvah. So much so that if I end up selling my field to another party, you can sue, void that sale, and pay fair market value for that property in Beis Din. The Beis Din will award you the rights to purchase and even nullify a sale even post facto. That's the law of bar mitzvah. And the argument for that is what? The buyer that has no connection to this area can always buy a piece of property somewhere else. But I can't, you who is the neighbor, you can't buy a property somewhere else and have the same efficiency for your farmland if you were to buy an adjacent piece of farmland. So it's only fair that the neighbor has first rights of refusal. So is that clear? That's the law of bar mitzvah. But there's an exception to the rule of bar mitzvah. What is the exception? Dim isha kansa sadesh al hametzar lo teitzei me hasade midin bar mitzvah de'ein kan v'de'asisa hayasher v'hatov d'chol kevuda bas melech penima ve'ein darka lihit asek b'masa umata. The law is that if the buyer, the third-party buyer who's not the neighbor, bought the property from me when I should have really offered it to my neighbor first, then she cannot be evicted from that property and you cannot nullify the sale. Because we make a special exception for a woman, we don't force her to get off the property and find another property. Kol kevuda bas melech penima, the glory of the princess is to remain private, snius, like you argued, Abi. And we shouldn't have to force her to forfeit the deal that she already made and that she's moved on to, and have to have her find another property. So the lichora halacha zu soseres Sugya tenu shemavur deisha kala lotzeis migever v'lo chashashu laha dechol kevuda. And so that's a stira to our Sugya. Our Sugya says that when the couple gets divorced, who has to find a new place? The woman. Because it's harder for a man to go into exile than a woman to go into exile. So how do you reconcile the two? Would anyone like to venture a teretz? What's the chiluk? What's the chiluk between the two? Can you think of a chiluk?
Talking about an adjacent property.
Yeah, but they're both predicated on what's easier. Is it easier for a woman to go into exile? So one Gemara says, no, kol kavuda bas melech penima. Let a woman remain private, and once she's settled, you shouldn't uproot her. And our Gemara says just the contrary. You should uproot her. Why should that be? So Rav Elyashiv offers a teretz. He says, "Elavadai delo arihacha binyan zug shenit garshu le'inyan hafkas." Bedin zug shenit garshu le'inyan hafkas habailus, אלא עצם הדיון שלו תדור כאן, אלא תחפש לה מקום אחר. The answer is, Rav Elyashiv suggested, the reason why the Gemara is more lenient with a woman when it comes to the purchase of a property is we don't want a woman to engage in commercial activity for no reason. That's where we say that a woman should remain modest and not have to venture out and try to wheel and deal in the real estate marketplace more than necessary. So once she's already made a purchase of a property, we don't evict her even if the neighbor wants that property. However, over here, where it's not a question of wheeling and dealing in the purchase of real estate, but rather just finding herself a place to live for rent, potentially, in kein lefi zeh v'adai de lechapes diyur stam lo mitzad masa umatin shel kiniya umechira el stam diyurin uvischirus. All we're dealing with is a woman finding another place to live, but not having to deal with the purchase of real estate. V'adai sheleisha kal yoter meha'ish. There we say it is easier for a woman to uproot herself. Ve'en kan kol kavuda de lo tzricha kan lasok b'masa umatin klal uklal. Because she won't have to engage in business activity, in the wheeling and dealing in the marketplace. Now, that's Rav Elyashiv's. She will, but Rav Elyashiv's argument is maybe she'll only have to rent, and renting a property without going through all of the paperwork of having to purchase a property is not as laborious and as much of a hardship. I think that the distinction that he's making is a little bit contrived. I'm not so happy with this teretz, but I do feel that he's onto something, because the fact is, the premise of this argument, I think, is what Simi said before. The reason why it's easier for a woman to go into exile, not so much that it's easier for her to have to pick up and uproot herself, but it's not as difficult for her when she has to find a new social group. That was the attitude of Chazal. I would argue that the Metzias has probably changed nowadays, and I'm not sure whether the halacha would change accordingly. We have no indication that it does. We have Piskei halacha from the Chachmas Adam and from the Aruch HaShulchan, and we're not going to go into those now because I just don't want to take up too much time. We'll go to the Shvus Yaakov in number 10. Echad shegiresh es ishto mibeli ketata klal. This was a real case. A man divorced his wife without any acrimony. I think that's very rare, but it does happen. Why did he divorce his wife? Rak mishum demeisale shehi mitzoraat ma'od ma'od. Because she had a terrible skin condition, maybe psoriasis, but he couldn't live with her anymore. The achshav hamegaresh rotza biritzano hatov latet la dira miyuchedet beveito bechinam. And the guy has rachmanis on her. Like, I'm not attracted to her anymore. She has serious defects in her physical appearance in her body. I can't live with her anymore, but I don't want to just dump her out on the street. So the proposal is brought to the Rabbanim is, I want to leave her a place to live in my house. I'll move on with my life. I'll make sure that she's provided for financially. She has a roof over her head. Okay, ishaper dami. Is this permitted according to halacha? V'hinei lo nela mimeni ma'dekaimu lan hamagaresh sisishta lo tader ima b'chatzer chadisa be'isr that's the Rashba, Siman Kuf Yud Tes, Odilma Benidon. Sorry, I can't just not remembering the abbreviation right now. Ach Dilma Benidon Didan, Shiny Kevin de Meisale, Chsvar Suhuskar Gamkin Bebes Yosef, Siman Kuf Yud Le'evin Ha'ezer, sorry. Siman Kuf Yud Design, that's what Aleph A stands for. B'Shem Chuvas Rashba Ri Gabe Zinsa Ye'uyan Sham. So he says, there's an argument to be made that even though the Gemara says that you're not allowed to live in the same neighborhood as the woman you divorce, that's only because out of a concern that you may rekindle the relationship, and we want to make sure that there's no promiscuity between the two. But here it's clear that they're not going to be promiscuous with each other. He is repulsed by her physically, but he has Rahmanis on her. So could you perhaps make the argument that in this kind of situation, she could continue living in his home? So the tshuva that the Shvus Yaakov lives at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century, Rav Reischer. So he says, tshuva, kedei levar hadin al mechono, utzrachti lahatik loshen harash b'shuva b'beis Yosef, siman kuf yud zayin. I have to first quote the language of the Rashba. He says, v'zel l'shono, be'afal gav debereis zvachim gabi isha lav legerishin omedes, kosav read afilu zinsa yechola lios tachta v'tushamshenu kishivcha. The Re says that if a woman has had an affair and the husband and wife are not allowed to live anymore together, she would be permitted to act as his maidservant and still come in and out of his house. What's the reason? Because he hates her. There's never any way he's going to go back and take her as his wife because of that betrayal. In other words, in the good old days, men had pride, and they would not take a man, they would not take a woman back who was unfaithful. So shiny hasam deleka lemecha shkulehai shema yavo oleha dekevin shezinsa tachtav sonei osa umausa be'enav adkan l'shana. So the Rashba explains, even though normally you're not allowed to live in the same neighborhood, let alone the same house with your divorcee, but here we don't have to worry that they're going to rekindle the relationship because he realizes that she has done something terrible. She's betrayed him, and he doesn't want to have anything to do with her physically. And therefore, you want to make the application to here also. When you know that he's not going to be intimate with her for the circumstances described, why don't we say the same thing? Skipped to the end of the line. Gam b'tshuvas avodas hagirshuni pasak mehaitame deharashba degrusha sheniskarsha mishum zenus muter loder beveso kevin demislei ayin sham devarav. We have other poskim who feel the same way. Ulanias devarav enam barum lahalacha v'kol shekain lamaisa. However, Rav Reischer says, I can't fully give my endorsement of this argument. Chada diikar divrei harashba him benuyim al divrei ri bereis vachem uvetoisvis shelefanenu b'daf beis divrei amaskol stam isha lav lagerishin omedes vafilu zinsa tachas baila mikol makam im lo yirtza bal lo v'nis v'yigarshena ela shelo tishamshenu ad kan l'shon atoisvis harei shelo huzkar shetishamshenu kishivcha. So first of all, the language of the Tosfos is that she's allowed to live in the same vicinity, but she can't act as a maid. So the Tosfos clearly is not saying the way the Rashba quoted it. V'af im nema der Rashba matza kein hanuscha b'shem ri mikol makam gam riva Rashba lo kamer ela belo niskar shadayin lo chayshin sheyiv al osa b'cheskas ishus kivin shesana'a osa. But maybe there the Rashba was only saying that the woman could still live with him so long as that he hasn't divorced her. But once he divorced her, maybe the Chachamim made a low plug. And they said that your divorcee, regardless of whether you have any amorous feelings towards her anymore or not, cannot live in your vicinity. And he brings a raya for that from a medrash in Evel Rabasi, and Gam Ramah, Lo Pasaka Haida Harashba B'Shem Ri, and the Ramah makes no qualifications. V'chein Kasav Shem Echalkas Mechokek, V'od Da'af L'das Shuvas Avodas HaGershuni, Sheposak L'Haila Rashba, Afil Shenizkar Shem Mikol Mokum Dafka Hasam Shemi Isel of Mishum Zenus, Shu Be'Isser Olamis. And furthermore, I could argue that when a woman committed adultery while married to her husband, that's a kind of offense that will linger forever. The husband will never be able to reconcile himself to ever go back to her. But let's say in our case, a woman maybe has psoriasis and the husband finds her to be repulsive, but maybe she'll heal. Maybe she'll get better. Maybe she'll find medicine for her condition, or maybe it'll go away. Kistimus Lashon Hashasu Poskim Damargarishis Ishto Lotodr Ima Yesibas Agerishin Mashiach Kenyirali Hachi Kamer Yaakov. So the Shvus Yaakov concludes that it makes absolutely no difference what the reason for the divorce is, whether it was an acrimonious divorce or an amicable divorce, or whether it's because he can't live with her anymore because he finds her repulsive or whatever. I also know of a case where a woman, for whatever reason, maybe there was hormonal changes in her body, but she became obese. And when he married her, she was a thin size 4 or 6, whatever it was. And he just couldn't live with her anymore, so they got divorced. But theoretically, let's say she gets her weight under control, they might want to reconcile, who knows? So in any event, these are all situations where, regardless of the reasons for the divorce, you can't live in the same vicinity and certainly not in the same house. Okay. So we have Divrei Binayahu. So this was a tshuva from Rav Binayahu Dayan Sephardi Posek. I'm just bringing you random piskei halacha. Ha'im hamegarish yachol lavo lebeis gerushaso b'Shabbos lasos kiddush levanav. Couple gets divorced. Kids are living with the wife. Can he come to the house Friday night to make kiddush for the kids? Nebuch, they want to see Tati. And she has no one to say kiddush. Can he come to say kiddush Friday night? So he writes, Ein nachon mitzad ha'alacha sheyiga ha'av ha'garush lebeit gerushato lasot shem kiddush b'kviyos b'Shabbos. It's not right. It's not right. V'gam im higia ba'akroi b'Shabbos v'haya gashum ein heter shiu b'yachad kol halayla b'dira afilu im habanim. And let's say it happens once in a while. Just so happens he happens to come and wish good Shabbos, and she says, would you mind making kiddush? Not on a regular basis, just this one Shabbos. And all of a sudden it starts to rain. Can he sleep over that night? Absolutely not, even if the children are present. Ki begrusha chamor hadavar, because we're very machmir, as you saw from the Gemara in Ksuvas. Va'afim ishto imo. And even if he's remarried, and he brings his wife to make kiddush, his new wife to make kiddush for the wife and the old wife and kids, kasav agrach palaji sheyesh lesor, you have to say no. V'chein kasav aget pashut shein lahakil kevin diodasu makeres beremizo sav. And since they previously had shared a relationship with each other, you cannot be mekel. Rav Bakshi Doron asked the question. Nishalti al yidei chevrat kibbutz sheitkarsha mibala imutar la lahamshich lagur b'kibbutz lachar gerushin. What if a husband and wife live on the same kibbutz? And all of the social activity is together on the kibbutz. So are they allowed to continue living on the same kibbutz? They're going to be eating together. They're going to be milking the cows together. They're going to have Toranut, whatever it is, together. Okay? Ekev ha'chaim ha'meshutafim v'hatidirut ha'gevoha shel mifkashim im bala l'sha'avar b'cheder ha'ochel ba'avoda ba'asifot v'chayei ha'chevra. So what's going to be the law? Ha'sho'elet tzina shehi yelidat ha'kibbutz. And the woman who's asking the divorcee saying, I was born on this kibbutz. I don't want to leave. Yesh labanim hagedelim b'kibbutz. My children are growing up on the kibbutz. B'kashla l'istagel d'parnes b'makam acher. And furthermore, am I going to find a job? This is my livelihood, to live on the kibbutz. So it's a very long tshuva. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. But the bottom line of Rav Bakshi Doron says, Lechatchila lo nachon sheisha sheitkarsha mibala taduri mo ba'oto kibbutz mishum ha'chaim ha'meshutafim ha'mivim lifkishot tidirot v'shutfut bein b'nei hazug. Lechatchila, it's not appropriate. They should try to find a long-term solution that one of them is going to leave the kibbutz. But if it's difficult for her, then mutar la lagur v'lechol b'cheder ochel meshutaf ein bazeh mishum iser dior b'chatzer acheres. They can at least eat in the same cheder ochel, in the same cafeteria. Eshet kohen shasur l'dar b'mamavoy asur lagur b'kibbutz shadino k'kfar katan. But if the husband is a kohen, then that throws a wrench further into it, and there are no heterim for her and her ex to live on the same kibbutz. Ulam im kibbutz gadol ba'ochlosin l'dat harama muteret v'yishlistapek l'dat maran v'shat adchak yesh lahakel. According to the Rama, this would be like a Rishus Harabim running through the city. If it's a huge kibbutz, like thousands upon thousands of people, and maybe what kibbutz is that big? I don't even know are there kibbutzim that are that big. The biggest kibbutz is how big in Israel today? I don't even know what the biggest kibbutz, 100 families, 200 families?
Yeah, about 100.
No,
What?
Yavna's got a few.
How much is Yavna? Or is Sod considered a kibbutz?
Yes. Down south. But
So-
they had about 125 families at the time. That was a long time.
Long time ago, Simi. When was the last time you worked with the cows?
Worked the watermelons.
Oh, okay, all right. When was the last time you harvested watermelons? It's been a while. Okay, so maybe it's grown since then. But anyway, if it's already now like a little city, so then maybe there's more room to be Makel, even if he's a Kohen. Okay, and he goes on. If Grusha Shaita Nesuli Yisrael, if her first husband was a Yisrael, then according to the Ramah, it would be usher for a small kibbutz, because that would be like a small village, but it would be okay for a large kibbutz. But according to the Ran, it would be permitted even if it's a small kibbutz, because it's like a mavui. And he goes through the Shitas Harishonim, but he says, Yesh lihimana mikol pigishot b'mizgeret avodah k'buah ben hagorish l'grushato. You should avoid at all costs any kind of meetings between the two. Kimokein ein lishtatef b'va'adot mitzumtzamot v'toraniyut mitzumtzamot. You should also avoid sharing the same toranut. Try to find changes in the schedule that you're not doing the same shifts. V'rak ba'asifat chaverim klalit u'va'avodah imispar anashim gadol muteret hashutafut. It's only when there are lots and lots of other people doing the same toranut that you can work doing the same shift. Something you wanted to,
PBT.
what does it say?
But Brenner was the largest one, 2,694 people back in 2021.
There you go. Okay, that's not so small. Nishlecht.
Givat Brenner, and the second is Kibbutz Yagur. Yagur.
I mean, most of it would seem they have big families, and they have roads.
Yeah,
You could say opposite sides of the road. But all this, it's talking about the wife, the woman having to leave. Does it matter if there's little kids involved or not?
That's the source.
well, presumably, whatever financial settlement is made between them, that could be a mitigating factor. Like she could say, how could you displace the children? You're taking them, they're going to force them to leave their school, their friends, and so forth. So there you could argue that tiltula di yeladim is kasha mitiltula di ish, right? Or tiltula di gever. You could possibly make that argument. I haven't seen it brought in the poskim, but it wouldn't surprise me if a basin would make that argument.
Like,
Right.
if they're separate, or the kids are a lot older, but like the little kid, you're displaced not only the move, displaced.
Yeah, I think it's a very valid point. I think it's a very valid point. The final thing that I saw was a tshuva from Tzvi Pesach Frank to Hagon Rav Yitzchak Una. Rav Yitzchak Una was a Rav in Germany before World War II. And he lived, I think he was born in the late 19th century and he passed away in the 20s. So he asked Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank the question that a couple has gotten divorced. They didn't have any children. They decided that, they're going to go their separate ways. But she runs a daycare out of the house that they were living in. She's willing to move out. He's going to keep the house, but she wants to keep the daycare center. That's her parnasa. And she has other women working in the daycare with her, so it's not a question of yichud. Would that be permissible? So you'll go through the tshuva, but bottom line is that essentially Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank goes through the whole sugya, and he comes out by saying, Im kein benidon didan nami zelo yizdame shetiya yechida b'li hayiladim ela l'shah chada b'lazeh ein chashash. If generally speaking, she's always with the kids, always with other teachers, and it's very rare for her to be there by herself, then you don't have to be so concerned. Of a kitzer hadavar, ein iser im ha'isha lo darasham b'kivius ela shi tamidim hayiladim l'chatzer latzeis yachlim ez hayiladim lo b'yichidus ba'ofen zeh ein la'esor. And therefore, we have no reason to prohibit her from continuing the daycare center, provided that she's always with other people, as a general rule. Okay, so what I just wanted to conclude with is that obviously there's a fifth chelek of Shulchan Aruch that is going to have all of these concerns. Like you mentioned, their kids are small, and her having to leave is going to create a hardship for the kids. I think a basin would certainly take that into consideration. But it's important to remember that these things do occur, these things do arise I mentioned before you came in, Laser, that we had this Shiloh. Someone came to me and said that I'm moving out of my house where my wife and I are divorced now. I moved out of the house, but my office is in the house. And I want to be able to come and work there from 9 to 5 every day. So I told the guy, based on the research that I had done, I said, if you can argue that your wife, I said, does your wife work? He says, yes, my wife is out of the house during the day. So I said, if you can and do you have adult kids? I know he has adult kids. Are the kids at home during the day? He says, yes, the kids are home during the day. So I said, provided your wife is out of the house and there are adult kids in the house, and that's the only room that you access from the time that you come in from the front door, you go straight to your office. I said, then you can justify this kind of arrangement. But on the long term, it's not something that you should try to maintain. You have to try and find other arrangements to eventually move your office out of the house. But on a temporary basis, I told him that he could do it because of all of those conditions that were being satisfied. But it's also important to know that, let's say the couple is completely divorced, but they both want to come and attend the same shul, and they want to stay with their same circle of friends. We've seen this in our own community. The couple gets divorced, and they want to share their friends, and they see each other every Shabbos. They're cordial with each other, even though they realize they're not meant to stay married. But there is the potential for this kind of fraternization. Rashi says the concern is that they could look at each other in an amorous way and try to rekindle the relationship surreptitiously so that no one will know about it. So I think it is appropriate that once a couple gets divorced, at the very minimum, not only should they live in separate homes, they should live in separate homes on different streets, and they should also probably one of them should choose a different shul. Easier said than done, okay? But that's what I wanted you to see for tonight,
I
okay?
guess it doesn't matter if they both get remarried. Yeah.
Yeah, if anything, that makes it worse.
They both get-
When they both get remarried, that makes it even worse. That's what we saw. That's what Chazal said. When there's the potential for them to get remarried, we can be a little bit more lax, because maybe they'll look at each other across the room at the Kiddush, and he's eating kugel and she's eating herring, and they'll think about the kugel and the herring at the old Shabbos table that they had, and they'll say, why did we get divorced? Why did we get divorced? And then maybe they'll get back together. But once they're both married, then there's even